was actually an interesting week for me. I was promoted at my job. Welcome to another video with me, B Dougie, and I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about myself for a moment in this video. I think that's not anything unlike any other videos. So specifically, I'm going to talk about how I got my job at GitHub. Now, this is a conversation that came up on the Twitch channel. I do live stream every Tuesday and Thursdays on Twitch. Check out the link in the description below if you want to see me live code on some Jamstack problems, some JavaScript. I spent the last couple Fridays making an open source contribution to a Go project. I'm kind of all over the place, but if you're just looking to see someone write some code, ask some questions. But I bring that up because this conversation happened on Twitch, and it sort of had to happen organically. Someone had come into the chat during the raid, and they asked how I got my job at GitHub. I think it's actually a great question to ask a lot of live coders on Twitch of how they got their job. So it's something I'm actually going to start asking more of, just me personally, because having that experience and knowing that, I think it will be very beneficial to anybody who's also looking for a job. But just getting your resume picked up, it's a hard time to do that. So there are a couple things I've done that have stood out. But what I've done is I have been pretty active on my Twitter. My Twitter is really where a lot of this opportunity came from. I tweeted this out a couple days ago, and it's how to sort of break into tech using Twitter. I actually did this, and I did this about 6 to 7 years ago, where I just decided one day that I was just going to start tweeting about my learning how to code journey. Because at the time I was learning how to do Ruby. I Googled top Ruby developers on Twitter, but the 50 plus Ruby developers to follow on Twitter. If you're learning JavaScript, if you're learning Rust, if you're learning whatever it is, like finding lists like this could be very crucial to you finding your next job or your first job, because there are some pretty heavy hitters, and like getting their attention could be crucial to you finding your first job in a matter of weeks versus a matter of months. I think past performance is not projection of future growth. So just because this worked for me doesn't mean that this will 100% work for you. But doing this, following people on Twitter, by far got me in the position where I'm at today. And how I got my job at GitHub I didn't submit a resume. I haven't sent any resumes to any jobs. Every job I've gotten has been either through Twitter or through a connection I made from Twitter, or because I had a public persona profile blog on the internet. And I was consistent about writing on it. I was consistent about tweeting. And it just made it a lot easier for the conversation to get started and people to know who I was by having myself that was able to actually putting myself out there and having, like, you can Google B Dougie and I will show up on the top of the list. You can Google Brian Douglas and I will show up on the first page. Brian Douglas is a very hard name to show up SEO wise because it's so generic, like Brian and Douglas. Actually, on YouTube itself, if you look for Brian Douglas on YouTube, you will find another YouTuber who has over 200,000 followers because the name is so common. There's so many Brians that were born in the 80s and late 70s. So I digress. Join me for this conversation. If you have any questions, definitely leave a comment below. If you like this video, definitely let me know with a like and a subscribe, and I appreciate that. But without further ado, here's a conversation about how I got my job at GitHub. How did you work at GitHub? I knew somebody who told me to apply, and I did. Okay, so I did a podcast. So I do this podcast called Jamstack Radio. If you really want to know the story of how I worked there, I did a podcast with someone who worked at GitHub. And the way, actually, let me do this. I think I gotta do this. Yeah, so the CTO flex time. This is, everybody strap in. I'm about to flex pretty hard. So I used to work at a company called Netlify. I was employee number 3 at Netlify. I'm actually, out of the 1 million devs, I'm like number 8,000 and something of users. So I was pretty early on in the whole Netlify thing. So I worked at this company, the CTO of Netlify. So I knew Swix. I still know Swix. But what I'm getting at is the CTO of Netlify, he hired this guy, Kyle Daigle. So he was like still in touch with Kyle Daigle, and he's like, hey, Netlify switched to GraphQL. You should have him on your podcast. Like literally episode 5. We're like episode like 65 or something like that at this point. So I was like, okay, cool. So I met Kyle, and then we just knew of each other, and like it's a great interview too as well on why GitHub Why GitHub? So I'm just laughing at the chat. Anyway, why GitHub chose GraphQL. That's what the podcast episode was on. So fast forward to Brian Douglas GitHub universe. I ended up applying for a talk. Oh yeah, good idea. Let me link it, because that way you don't have to struggle through my Google food that I just did. So I spoke at GitHub Universe, and I should be more specific, because I spoke at GitHub Universe, low-key legend. I spoke at GitHub Universe. I think this is it. Using GraphQL API to manage. Yeah, so I spoke at GitHub Universe because I ended up using the GraphQL API after that conversation. So shortly after that conversation, I was like, oh, I'm going to use this thing. So I built this project, which is open sourced. So this open source is still around. It's actually built on the GitHub GitHub GraphQL API. So, sorry, there's a lot of sort of pointing and trying to figure out how the story connects. But this project here that's still around, I built that. I did a talk on how I built it and how I used the GraphQL API. That's me with the with what I thought was a flat top. I probably should brush my hair, but anyway. So anyway, I gave this talk, and right in the front row, which is funny because I could literally go to the GitHub issue. One of the managers who was under Kyle was actually sitting in the front row listening to me. Yeah, that was actually what I was going for. That was what was it, 3 years ago? Whole nother Brian back then. But yeah, so the engineering manager that was sitting in the front row, actually he was IC at that point. He ended up opening up an issue about my issues around the GitHub GraphQL API, and they actually went and solved some of those problems. And they actually took a picture of my slide, and it's in a GitHub issue. And if it wasn't private information in a private repo, I would actually share that. But anyway, long story short, I ended up running into Kyle at this conference. He said, hey, you should work at GitHub. We're hiring. And I was like, yeah, I'll think about it. And then the guy who, the guy who took the picture, he was an IC. Because then I ran into the guy's manager. So between Kyle and the guy who took the picture, his manager was in between him. A week later, I went to GraphQL Summit. And GraphQL Summit, I did this talk about wrappers. So let me see if I could find this, Brian. I was actually doing lots of talks at that time. So here I have a GraphQL wrapper. Oh, it was a lightning talk. Oh, you know what? I have a playlist that I can find. Anyway, I ran into him at the second GraphQL Summit ever. Doesn't matter. We don't have to pull up the actual talk. And then I ran into the manager, and he was like, hey, you should work at GitHub. You had a great talk. And I was like, I don't know. Not sure. But so anyway, long story short, those three people both asked me within 2 weeks to work at GitHub. So eventually I said yes. I ended up getting invited to an after party at GitHub. Because that's a thing. It's actually a pretty awesome thing. And ended up talked to all of them, and then had basically a first interview right there. And then I had start the interview process. And then that was for an engineering role. But basically they bait and switched me, and they're like, hey, you've been doing some pretty hefty talks on stuff that no one else at GitHub's talking about. And you're not even working at GitHub. You should work here and do that. So I was hired as GitHub's first developer advocate. So now I'm a developer advocate at GitHub, and all I do is stream on Twitch and do a bunch of random stuff, and do some open source stuff. So yeah, and GitHub Actions. I do a lot of GitHub Actions, because I sort of own that feature. So that is where I'm at. So I've been at GitHub for 2 years and 8 months. So that was that whole process. So back from that first podcast to eventually to the talk, to eventually going to do another talk the next week, to now working at GitHub. So you asked for the story, I gave it to you. There you go. Nat. Too long to be clipped. Yeah, I'll grab the highlight later, and then I'll make it into a YouTube video. Did I tell you about my YouTube channel? How long does it get in the delve? So Brandon, you're not a developer advocate, are you? You're an engineer, right? I can't remember. We chatted about this. No leveling info. Levels that, yeah. Software can't stop, won't stop. Yeah, so I became an advocate at Netlify because I was an engineer who wrote blog posts. And I was an engineer that didn't mind. So that actual, those talks that I gave, I was a full-time engineer at Netlify. So I just did it because I wanted to. I had a goal of, man, I actually have a video coming out on my YouTube about my first conference talk. But I went into it at a couple streams ago. Basically, I gave a talk around React Native, and yeah, I gave a talk about React Native, and I had a goal of doing more talks because I had so much fun of doing it. So I built a plan of, I would write blog posts, and then I would take those blog posts and submit them as CFPs to conferences, and it worked. And basically I just started talking. So I did like 40 plus talks in 1 year, 2017. So that same year that I just basically talked about working at GitHub was the same year I did the most talks at conferences ever. My entire life was the first year that I actually started doing conference talks. And the way I did it is because I did one talk the year prior, and I met Ben Alequidu, who's now at Stitch Fix. And I asked him, how do you do so many talks? Like, how do you even organize all this? And the way he explained it to me, he just told me his secret. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll do that. And I did it, and it worked. And now I work at GitHub. So that's basically how that worked. Oh, sorry. Part of that reason, while that sort of ramp up period, Netlify asked me to be a full-time developer advocate. And I was like, no, I don't want to be a developer advocate. I just want to be an engineer. And I'll still do blog posts and do talks, but I don't want to be a developer advocate. And then 6 months later, we hired a second front-end engineer. So I was doing a lot of JavaScript. I interviewed in Go for Netlify. And when I got there, I ended up doing JavaScript. I still laugh about this all the time. Like, my tweet today was, and it's funny that I'll tell you the secret sauce in a second. Y'all have to keep listening for a second. But I tweeted this today that I wrote 2 lines of Go code. And this is like an inside joke with myself and everybody else who knows my Go story. I interviewed at Netlify and I wrote Go. But when I got there, I literally wrote like maybe like a handful of lines of Go. And then I only wrote React, because when I got there, no one wanted to write React. No one really knew JavaScript that well, or nobody wanted to. And I came from a space where I had just finished learning JavaScript and React, and I switched everything from Angular to React back in like 2016. That was my first job, my first thing that I did at Netlify. So once I finished that, they're like, oh, you just keep doing the React stuff. We'll teach you Go eventually. And so what's funny is someone who liked my tweet is the CEO of Netlify, because he knows that story. He knows I only wrote JavaScript. He's also, before I joined Netlify, he was the only one that wrote JavaScript. So he was just trying not to write JavaScript. So he basically just threw it all on me. And that's all I did my entire 2 years at Netlify. So I say that's a whole nother story. I guess this is storytelling. That's what I'm doing. So the secret is subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I'm literally gonna to mention it in a video that I'm actually working on right now. But basically, long story short, every year during Christmas, so 2 weeks of Christmas, I make a list of like 20 ideas of things I want to write, I want to learn in code. So last year, 2 years ago, it was like caching. I just wanted to be better at caching. Had no idea of like how to do it well, how to do it like great in cache and validation. So like I'll write a bunch of blog posts, like titles and abstracts on this content, and I'll just create 20 of them nonstop while there's no work happening. And what I do is I just submit those to conferences, and whichever ones get accepted, those are the things I talk about. So the only reason why I started talking about GraphQL in 2017 is because all those talks got accepted. And then what I did, I basically called it conference-driven development. I would then write code to support those abstracts. So I had a hypothesis of like, oh, I wonder, one of the things I was talking about is how to basically embed GraphQL into your current API. Like, how do you do it without like overdoing it? How do you do it without like deleting entire repos and starting over from scratch? And that was a talk I gave at GraphQL Summit. So conference-driven development, definitely the thing. That will be the video title when I eventually mention it. But Hopefully I'll do a blog post about that too as well, because I don't really talk about that a lot. But essentially, don't write any code until your talk gets accepted, and then when your talk gets accepted, then you sort of push yourself to ship something. And the way I did that is that it helped me learn GraphQL really quickly, but I learn well when I have a deadline. So if I'm just sitting here like what I'm doing right now, and I'm sort of like farting around with Rust and like doing whatever I want, like I've been trying to work on this for 2 weeks. This is the first time I actually touched a repo and even looked at it. So if I didn't have like a deadline, then I wouldn't actually be, I would have had, probably if I had a deadline, I would have got to this much quicker. So I'm looking forward to actually submitting the JS time as the conference talk. Miles has already submitted one. But yeah, looking for, yeah, everybody's playing games. So, well, I do appreciate everybody coming through. Friday's the best day for my work coding, ironically. Honestly, so Friday's the one day we don't have meetings. That's why I stream twice a day. It's because no one's looking for me throughout the day, which is beautiful. And I highly appreciate that. I think the best place to go, if y'all just go to BDougie Live, you'll find my Twitter, you'll find my YouTube, you'll find everything you need to know about me. I stream every Tuesday and Fridays. So Friday tends to be open source in the morning, and I tend to do random stuff in the afternoon. Lately it's been Baybot. Baybot's what you've been seeing on screen here. So that's Baybot. I meant to actually update Baybot, but I think I needed that. Me and Bay need some time alone, so I'll end up working on Bay this weekend, and I've got some extra commands I'm going to be adding. I think I'll add a command to let people know what my streaming setup is, because that came up twice today. But if you did want to see my actual streaming setup, still mixing the Flex, I have it ready. I just never opened it because all the conversation. I never opened up the repo. But yeah, if y'all want to see me flex my my studio, my studio space, I did do a video there as well. So like, subscribe, appreciate y'all, and I'm gonna go ahead and drop. So peace, and I think I've been ending this with saying stay saucy, but let me know if you hate that. All right.